He was young and often looked at successful people with admiration mixed with self-doubt. He observed them from afar, classmates who spoke with confidence, athletes who seemed fearless, entrepreneurs who appeared in newspapers, and convinced himself that they were born different from him. Smarter, braver, luckier. In N's mind, success was a gift granted at birth, and somehow his name had been left off the list. Every failure became proof. When his studies declined, he believed he lacked talent. When he hesitated to speak up, he blamed his nature. "Maybe I just don't have what it takes," he whispered whenever things did not go his way. That thought gradually shaped his choices. Instead of trying again, he stepped back. Instead of risking embarrassment, he stayed silent. Opportunities passed by, not because he was incapable, but because fear had learned to speak in his own voice. Over time, fear became familiar, seeping into the rhythm of his life like an uninvited companion. It told him that standing still was safer than moving forward, that dreaming was dangerous, and that effort without guaranteed success was foolish. So Anne shrank his ambitions, chose the familiar over the unknown, chose silence over boldness. At night, he lay imagining another version of himself, bolder, more willing to try, failing openly. But by morning, those thoughts sank under the weight of doubt. Still, deep inside, beneath many layers of hesitation, something remained unsettled. A small voice asked why effort and imagination hurt less than regret in real life. He realized that even the people he admired carried scars of failure they rarely spoke about. Slowly, almost reluctantly, an awareness formed. Perhaps strength was not something one was born with, but something one built. But understanding did not immediately lead to action. Fear did not leave quietly. It resisted. It clung on. And so, Anne stood at the edge of change, stuck between the comfort of old excuses and the frightening possibility that his limits had never been real, only accepted. One day, Anne sat quietly in the living room watching his young nephew learn to walk. The child wobbled, arms stretched wide, his face full of determination. After a few shaky steps, he fell onto the carpet. The sound made Anne tense, expecting a long cry. But after a brief whimper, the boy wiped his face, crawled to the edge of the table, grabbed on, and pulled himself up again, without hesitation. Without shame, without doubt, without doubt. No one had taught him to be afraid. No one had told him he was incapable. He simply tried, fell, and tried again. Watching this, something inside him shifted. He realized that fear was not something we were born with. It was something we learned. And strength was the same. It was not an innate gift, but something built through repetition, through stumbling, through standing up while the floor still hurt. The child did not compare himself to anyone. He did not measure progress by perfection. Each fall was simply part of the process, not a judgment of his worth, and felt his chest tighten as he thought about his own life. How many times had he fallen once and concluded he could never get back up? How many times had he mistaken failure for destiny? In that simple moment, and understood a truth he had avoided for years. No one is born knowing how to walk, just as no one is born strong. Strength is learned in the same way, one step at a time, one fall at a time, driven not by confidence, but by the courage to try again, and began to reflect more deeply on the stories behind success, stories rarely told in full. He realized that the victories people admired were only the final chapter, not the entire book. Behind every medal were countless losses no one applauded. Behind every masterpiece were thousands of discarded sketches, crooked lines, failed attempts hidden in notebooks and trash bins. Athletes trained for years, losing match after match, pushing their bodies through pain and disappointment. Artists stared at blank pages for hours, creating work they disliked before finding something worth keeping. Entrepreneurs poured time, money, and hope into ideas that collapsed again and again before one finally stood. When he connected these journeys, a clear pattern emerged. What they shared was not flawless talent or effortless confidence, but a willingness to face failure rather than run from it. They treated mistakes as lessons, not sentences. Failure was not a stop signal, but an arrow pointing toward improvement. Comparing this with his own habits, and felt a quiet discomfort. He had avoided failure because he believed it was evidence of weakness, and in doing so, he had avoided growth itself. The thought unsettled him, yet brought a strange sense of relief. If success was built on repeated failure, then his past mistakes were not dead ends. They were simply unfinished steps. For the first time, failure felt less like a wall and more like a door, and understood that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward despite it. And in that realization, he felt an inner shift. Perhaps the path he feared most was the path he needed to take. From that day on, and made a quiet but powerful decision to change. He stopped chasing instant breakthroughs and promises of overnight transformation. Instead, he focused on small actions each day. He learned one skill at a time, even when progress was nearly invisible. He corrected bad habits one by one, understanding that change did not come from force, but from consistency. He tried the very things he once feared, speaking up in a meeting, sharing an unfinished idea, saying yes to an opportunity he had previously avoided. Each step was small, almost insignificant, but it required courage. There were days when he failed and felt familiar doubt return, whispering that he was moving too slowly. But this time, and did not stop. He reminded himself that strength grows quietly, without noise. Like muscles forming beneath the skin, takes time before it can be seen. Week after week, then month after month. He began to notice subtle changes. His mind stayed calmer when things went wrong. Fear no longer controlled every decision. He became more present, more willing to endure discomfort. The world around him did not change overnight. But he did. Each steady step layered confidence onto experience, replacing excuses with effort, and understood that true strength was not created in moments of victory, but in ordinary days when no one was watching. And as he continued forward, he realized a deeply comforting truth. Slow progress, if consistent, can carry a person much farther than brief bursts of motivation. Still, there were times when Anne wanted to give up. There were days when exhaustion pressed heavily, and the road ahead seemed longer than he had expected. When things became difficult, the familiar voice returned, soft but sharp. "You can't do this." Before, Anne would have believed it and retreated to safety. Now he paused and asked a different question, one he had never asked before. What can I learn from this? That small shift made a great difference. Failure was no longer an accusation. It became information. Each mistake pointed to something he did not yet understand, not something he was incapable of. Gradually, curiosity replaced self-doubt. When facing difficulty, he observed instead of judged. When he failed, he analyzed instead of withdrew. He approached challenges as puzzles, not threats. This perspective did not erase discomfort, but it gave pain a purpose, and realized that curiosity softened fear. It created space between who he was and what he experienced, allowing him to grow without attacking himself. Over time, the critical voice lost its power. It still appeared, but it no longer controlled his actions. In its place grew patience and persistence, and understood that giving up often came from unanswered questions, not from true inability. And by choosing to learn instead of, he discovered that every obstacle carried a lesson capable of shaping him into someone stronger than he had ever believed. And Anne fell again, many times. There were small, quiet failures, and there were heavy ones that shook his confidence. There were days when disappointment sank deep into his chest, when effort seemed wasted and progress vanished overnight. But this time he did not stay down. He allowed himself to feel frustration instead of denying it. He accepted sadness, anger, and fatigue, understanding that emotions were not signs of weakness, but proof that he cared. After that moment, he stood back up. Sometimes standing up meant nothing more than taking a deep breath and continuing with the next small task. Other times, it meant admitting he could not do everything alone and asking for help, a step that once felt like failure. He learned that support did not diminish strength, it multiplied it. With every fall and every recovery, Anne sensed something changing inside. The fear of failure lost its sharp edge. Falling was no longer the end of the road. It was simply part of the journey forward. He began to trust himself more, not because he avoided mistakes, but because he knew he could survive them. Each time he stood up, he understood that he did not grow weaker from failure. He grew stronger through endurance. Strength, he discovered, was not built by never falling, but by always choosing to rise, even when the ground was still cold beneath his hands. In the end, Anne understood a simple truth that reshaped how he saw himself and the world. Strength had never been about never falling, never failing or never being afraid. Strength was always choosing to stand up, no matter how many times the ground knocked the breath out of him. Now he could clearly see that every stumble was a lesson, every obstacle a silent teacher preparing him for the next step. The people he once admired were not different from him because they had never struggled, but because they refused to let struggle define their limits. And realize that no one is born strong. Strength is not written into bones at birth. It is carved into us through effort, patience, and courage. Anyone can become strong, but not in a single moment or a dramatic transformation. It happens day by day, through small choices that once seemed insignificant. It happens step by step, when we choose to face discomfort instead of running from it, when we meet fear with action instead of excuses. Looking back, En felt grateful for the version of himself who had doubted and hesitated, because that was where the journey began. And looking ahead, he no longer searched for proof that he was good enough. He knew that as long as he continued to stand up, learn, and move forward, strength would keep growing within him, quietly, steadily, and undeniably.